Pontiac feels that the Fiero is exactly the car they set out to design, because it makes the idea of getting someplace incidental to the act of driving. The way Pontiac sees it, there are only two types of people in the world: those who prefer to take the long way home, and those who haven't driven a Fiero yet.
If you've been watching my videos, you probably know that it's been taking a long time for me to work through this Fiero restoration. I feel like the guy from the Fiero video forgot about the third type of person, the one who's restoring the Fiero and taking forever. With school, orchestra, sports, and everything else going on, it's taking a lot longer than I'd hoped. Many have come before me and never finished. The junkyard is littered with the failed hopes and dreams of others, with the tales of what once was. Although I've never done this before, I'm very committed to completing my Fiero, Silver, and getting it on the road before the year's up. In my last video, I assembled the bottom end of the engine. In this video, I'm going to get the top end assembled and get the entire thing mounted to the engine cradle. With the camshaft already installed in the previous video, I start by installing the oil pump and pump drive. The pump drive gear will need to be installed first, since the pump itself will interface with the drive gear once installed. I carefully coat the gear with assembly lube and insert the drive gear into the oil pump slot. Remember, the notched side goes into the engine first. Although we saved the original shaft bushing, and we could easily reuse it, Melling had a brand new one on Rock Auto and made in the USA for under $5. This restores much of the original clearance and eliminates unnecessary slop in the drive gear, which can slowly damage the new camshaft. We coat this new bushing with assembly lube and slide it right into the slot. We pin the bushing down with a washer and a stud. We'll keep this here for painting, but we'll replace it with the correct stud and block-off plate. With that installed, we flip the motor and begin installing the oil pump. We apply a thin layer of high-torque RTV sealant meant for the high heat contact with oil. This will help seal the new high-volume oil pump and ensure proper pressure. We pour a bit of assembly lube down into the oil pump and install it on the proper mating surface. Remember, in the previous video, we made sure to install the correct bearing cap bolt with the stud in the right place. This stud is used to affix the oil pickup. We reuse the original bolts, which we'd bagged and tagged, and finger tighten, and then hand tighten them down. Next, we use a torque wrench to correctly torque them down to the correct specification in the service manual, and finally, we installed the crush nut to hold down the pickup tube. We do a little bit of cleanup and then install the old oil pan dry. We will be replacing this oil pan as it's somewhat dented and rusty, but we need to install it so that we can paint the engine later in this video. Next, I begin assembling the cylinder head. We sent this out to the machine shop as well to check for cracks, straightness, and to prepare the valve seats. I begin by installing brand new Viton valve stem seals. Unlike on the 1987 and 1988 models, the seals get installed only on the intake valve stems. I use a 1/2 inch socket extension and a rubber mallet to properly seat them. Next, I install the valves themselves. I flip the cylinder head on its side and install the new valves. I ordered a brand new set of OEM specification valves from the Fiero store, which came with 4 new intake and 4 new exhaust valves. The smaller exhaust valves go in easy, while the intake valves must carefully be installed while spinning to prevent damage to the Viton seals. With the valves installed, I flip it back and begin installing the oil leak down seals. These get installed on all 8 valves and help prevent oil from leaking into the combustion chamber. I slide each one onto the valve and it goes into the lower notch on the valve. With the valves ready, I can begin installing the rest of the valve hardware. I use a large C-clamp to compress the valve springs and spring retainer so that I can install the valve locks. The C-clamp requires significantly more force than I could manage, so my dad helps by compressing the spring, allowing me to get to the locks properly installed. I went with brand new stock rated springs, but reused the retainers and spring cups. We used brand new heavy duty Melling valve locks because they're so inexpensive. With all the valve springs and keepers installed, it's time to reinstall the cylinder head. But first, I clean the surface of both the cylinder head and the engine. I use a little bit of denatured alcohol and wipe down the surface. The engine has already been cleaned by the machine shop, so no scraping is needed. I use a brand new Made in USA Felpro head gasket, which goes on dry. There are 2 dowels installed in the block, so it can only go on one direction. With the head gasket in place, my dad helps me carry the cylinder head onto the engine block, and we slide it into place. Remember, with the dowels installed in the block, this can only go on one way. With the cylinder head in place, it's really starting to look like an engine, and I'm getting pretty excited. I put in place the new cylinder head bolts. The bolt kit is specifically made for the Iron Duke, and it contains stretch bolts. This means they can only be installed once and cannot be reused a second time, so I have to do this right the first time. 2 of the bolts have a threaded end which must go in the correct location. These are used for grounding and mount points for components. The bolts also have sealant at the base to prevent water intrusion. Make sure to reference the factory service manual for the correct location. Don't take my word for it. Before I use my torque wrench, I snug each of them down with a socket in the correct order. The diagram shown is the correct torque and tightening sequence for the 1984 to 1986 cylinder head. The reason for this is to ensure that the pressure is spread out evenly across the cylinder head, starting from the middle to the outside, which helps the head gasket seal properly. With everything snugged down, I begin torquing down the cylinder head. I start first by torquing everything down to 32 foot-pounds in the proper sequence. I then switch to the larger torque wrench and follow this up with a 60 foot-pounds, again in the proper sequence. Finally, I torque each of them down to 90 foot-pounds. If you're also doing this step, understand that different manuals recommend different torque specifications. The service manual recommends significantly less, while the Haynes manual recommends more. This has to do with the bolts you're using and the year. I'm using torque to yield bolts on an 85 block, so I'm going with 90 foot-pounds. With the cylinder head installed, I move my attention to the lifter galley. I used a brand new set of Engine Tech lifters, which come in packs of 4, pre-oiled. To minimize a dry start, I soaked the lifters right side up in a cup of regular non-synthetic oil the night before. This will ensure that I've eliminated most of the bubbles from the lifters before installation. I pitch the engine at a slight angle to prevent oil from dripping down the side of the block and begin inserting the lifters. Typically, roller lifters can be reused by rebuilding them, generally replacing the spring on the inside. However, with a zero lash engine, I want to make sure that I get back as much of the original tolerances as I can. Any wear on the pushrod seat or the roller has now been eliminated. As I install these lifters, I want to make sure they're turned so that I can install the lifter guides. This is the next thing I install. Without the lifter guides, the rollers could turn and would very quickly stop being roller lifters. The lifter brackets are paired by the lifters for each cylinder. With these installed, I move on to the 2 retaining brackets. These brackets ensure that the lifter guides don't pop off during operation. They are attached to the engine using 4 very unique bolts that cannot easily be replaced, so hopefully you've saved and cleaned these bolts. Next, I use my adorable 1/4 inch torque wrench, and I torque down each of the 4 bolts to 90 inch-pounds. Make sure you read that correctly and don't accidentally do 90 foot-pounds or you'll have a pretty bad day. Before I replace the lifter galley cover, I install new pushrods. But wait! These brand new pushrods don't fit. Apparently, I ordered a set for the 1987 and newer Iron Duke. This means I'll have to reuse my old pushrods. This is not a huge problem as they were still in excellent shape. I carefully place each of the pushrods into the proper hole and begin assembling the top end. The first thing to go on are the valve guides. These get installed under everything else, so they need to go down first. They are specifically numbered so you know which direction and for which piston they're installed. Since I have access to everything now, I put a little bit of assembly lube on the top of the pushrods and the valves. This will ensure reduced wear on startup. Next, I carefully place the rocker arm and rocker ball and hand tighten each of the studs as I install them. I went with brand new rocker arms from Melling, which also came with new rocker balls. I cleaned and reused the original rocker arm studs since these are still good and do not take any wear. Once again, while the old rocker arms were still good, I wanted to regain as much of the original tolerances as I could. With the original valves, the pushrod seat and valve stem surfaces would have wear after 200,000 miles. And this is cheap insurance. As I'd mentioned earlier, the Iron Duke is a zero lash engine, which means that there is no adjusting for the valve lash and you simply tighten down the rocker arm studs. I begin by hand tightening them with the socket wrench, and then switch to the torque wrench and torque them down to specification. With the top end complete, I begin prepping the engine for paint. I install a spare valve cover with the old cork gasket, and then install just a couple of the valve cover bolts to keep it in place. If you remember from the previous video, I separately painted the valve cover, brackets, and lifter plate, so these are from the spare 88 motor that I have. I need to close up all the holes, so I also install an inexpensive Man oil filter, my spare water neck, the used spark plugs, and then begin taping off the intake, exhaust, and other holes. I also install some of the used sensors in each of the sensor holes. I don't care what goes where since I plan to replace them anyway. With the engine rolled out into the driveway and some quick cleanup with the brake cleaner, I begin the painting process. I start off with some high temp gray engine primer. I liberally spray this all over the engine to make sure I get into all of the little gaps and spaces. This is metal etching primer, which will provide a much better base for the final paint color. After letting it sit for an hour, I then followed it up with Duplicolor Forward Gray engine enamel. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe. I'm really proud of the fact that I just reassembled this whole engine. Like, that's super cool to me. In the next video, I'm going to be adding on all of the engine accessories, and in a later video, I'm going to be working with the transmission because I just got it back from the machine shop. So if you want to see when those two videos come out, make sure to subscribe and enable notifications. Thank you again for watching.
Where is he? We are on the search for Clef Penny. Every time I see a red car, I immediately am like, oh my god, is that him? No, it's not. Where is he? I'm very excited.